and welcome to the Womxn Show on Cape Town TV. I'm Lynn Nel. Tonight we're going to be speaking about the intersection of violence against women and violence against children, specifically looking at the effect of domestic violence on children as they grow up and into adults. Now, research has shown that up to 50% of children worldwide are exposed to some violence in their lifetime. And when you think about the fact that 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence, we can ascertain that a lot of that exposure comes from watching the violence between their parents or between parents and other intimate partners. After the break, we'll be hearing from someone, an author, who wrote a book about the domestic violence that she experienced and viewed as a child while growing up. And we'll speak to some experts about the trauma of watching domestic violence unfold as a child. But before that, and to put this conversation into context, we are going to have a look at a short video that shows us what children actually need in order to grow into healthy children, thriving children, and healthy adults. Let's have a look.
As children, we don't just want to survive, we want to thrive and reach our full potential. All children need nurturing care from birth into adolescence. They need good health, good food, protection from harm, opportunities to learn, and caregivers who listen and respond to children's needs. Children need healthy relationships and support from their friends and family. And families also need support to give children the best start in life. All children need to be protected from violence and abuse. No child should be beaten at home or bullied on the playground. And no child should have to witness violence on the streets or in their family. Clinics, schools, and youth groups need to work together to help children make healthy choices and to protect themselves from drugs and teenage pregnancy. Children who cannot read will struggle to learn. So, we need to make time to read every day and make sure children have books in the classroom and back at home. Schools and clinics should be child and family friendly, places where all children are treated with dignity and respect. Together, these 5 ingredients of nurturing care provide a strong foundation. They protect children from stress and they help children to thrive and reach their full potential so that they can do well at school, find a good job, and help build a stronger economy and a more caring society. The good news is that South Africa is working together with countries from around the world to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. These 17 goals aim to end poverty and hunger, improve children's health and education, protect the environment, and create a more peaceful and equal world. By working together, we can protect the planet for future generations and make sure that no child gets left behind.
Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we're speaking about the intersection between violence against women and violence against children, as well as the effect of domestic violence on children as they are growing and as we grow into adults. And joining me in studio is Lynn Nel, who is the author of The Right Daughter Speaks. Lynn, thank you so much for joining us.
Lenina, thank you so much for the invitation and thank you so much for having me.
Yes. Lynn, I'm so excited to have you on the show because you wrote a very controversial book, which is controversial in family terms. What you did essentially was speak out of the house, you know, because
I know.
that's essentially what we're not supposed to do. And in The Right Daughter Speaks, you document and detail sort of the domestic violence that unfolded in your home and in your life as you were growing up. And so, just to start off, because you start off when you were very young, I wanted to know, were you aware of the domestic violence as a young child and as you were growing up?
Well, I wasn't, in the beginning, I wasn't aware of it because I was like your typical daddy's child, your daddy's daughter. I loved my father. I adored my father. And I suppose you read it in the book, like everybody always came to me to tell me, you've got such a handsome dad. Oh, your dad is so charming. Oh, your dad is so... I was like a typical daddy's child. But what I do remember is there have always been a very bad relationship between, at that age, when I was in my primary years. There has always been a very bad relationship between my father and my brother, and I could not understand that. And I remember the one time my brother ran away, and he walked from Paarl all the way to Kraaifontein to my grandmother. So that was quite a distance for a young, and he was in primary school at the moment as well, at the time. And I remember when my dad went to go fetch him, and my dad came back, and my dad asked him, like, am I such a bad father? And my brother didn't answer him, but my brother looked at him with such hatred, you know. And I actually hated my brother at that time, because, you know, how could you hate my dad? But I remember the first time when my dad actually abused my mom in front of me. I couldn't sleep that night. It's like, I couldn't believe it. It for any child, it was like my whole world was shattered, you know? So, but I didn't understand the relationship even then. You know, like when you come from an abuse household, it's like you're very confused. You actually don't know what's right or what's wrong. And when you read in an abusive home, it's like that's the right way. You don't know any other way. You don't know that, you know what, this is not supposed to be. This is not right. This is not fair. This is not what love looks like, you know. So, no, I wasn't aware when I was a child, but I do remember that I was a very unhappy child, like, after that. And I do know that my brother also, like, we were very quiet children, and people always, like, you know, I remember they used to commend my mother and my father on our good behavior and be such well-mannered children. But it wasn't because we wanted to be well-mannered. It's because we had to. We were both so scared of my dad. Like, we knew we had to behave. My dad wouldn't abuse us in front of people. You know, everybody used to think, but when we got home and the hidings we got, I mean, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy's child, even. So, yeah, we were very unhappy children. That much I remember. But not the abuse. I think everything actually started becoming clear to me once I wrote the book. I mean, even as an adult, you if you don't deal with your issues of your childhood, you're a confused person. And I was a very, very confused and unhappy person when I grew up. And I think everything became clear to me, and life really started making sense to me after the book. And it's funny because I raised the child myself.
Yeah.
But, you know, there was a lot of things that actually inspired the book. But I think one of the and this is something I didn't tell you, I remember that I always promised myself that I will do differently, I will do better, I won't do this to my child. But, you know, you get so caught up in life, and I mean, I was a single mom, so I had a career, and then I had a child that, like, I'm the only Uber mommy, I'm the only one that there's no help. So it can be draining for a single mom. And I remember the one day I went to go pick up my child at school because the principal called me. He got into some mischief and all of that. And it wasn't the first time that it happened that month. And I was so angry with him because I had to leave work, right, to go pick him up, which I felt was so unnecessary, like, because the principal sent him home. She said, just come fetch your child. So I went to go fetch him, and I remembered that as we were driving, I'm like, why do you always have to? And I lift my hand, and my child shrink back, and I saw the fear in his face. And, you know, like, it stopped me, my hand stopped in mid-air, and it brought memories back as to the fear I felt for my child. And then I said to myself, like, and my child was in a senior in primary school, and I said, and I remember saying to myself, like, I don't want to see my child fearing me. Yes, I want to discipline him, but I don't want him to shrink back in fear for me. Like, that's not love. Because, I mean, like, abusive parents, and for a lot of people who don't know, who were raised the same way in an abusive house, because like it's a cycle that happens over and over and over again. So and it was the same with my parents. I mean, their parents were abusive and they became abusive. So I actually promised myself that I'm going to do better, and that was also one of the reasons why I wrote the book, because I thought, like, fear is not love. Like, you know, and a lot of the older generation, they have that imprinted in them that, like, you discipline your child and when they show fear, like...
Exactly.
Yeah,
and, I mean, corporal punishment's only recently, this year, if I'm not mistaken, been banned through legislation.
Exactly.
Then I want to come back to, you said you were completely unaware sort of the violence between your parents. And so first I want to ask, you mentioned the first time that you realized that your father had hurt your mother. And in the book you speak very candidly about the very many times that he locked her out of the house to sleep outside, even in winter, even in the cold, without blankets. And she did that. She spent whole nights outside, like on the stoop or something, I'm assuming.
She didn't even come knock for help to say, let me in or stand by the door. She obeyed her husband. Like, that for me is just, I don't know, I can't wrap my around that part, you know. Because it wasn't his home, it was their home. I mean, they were married in community of property. She contributed as much to the house as he does, so it wasn't his home. It was her home as well, and it was her house as well.
And there was a night when the police actually got out. She was outside, but instead of going for help, she hid away.
She hid away, and she only told me that, like, when I was already on my own. She told me that story, that she actually hid away. And I remember and you know, like, and this is one of the things that is so important, is like, we need to speak to children, and I think, you know, there need to be programs to tell children, this isn't right, this isn't, because I remember when my dad used to throw my mother out, he would come to me, I don't know, for some reason, I don't know if it was because I was a student in primary school, but for some reason, me adoring him was important to him. So my dad would come to me and he would say to me, like, you know, that a woman is supposed to honor her husband. You know what the Bible says, it is in the Bible. And in the Bible it says that he can punish her. So she doesn't want to listen. So, and that's why she's sleeping outside. It's not because he is cruel, but it's because she doesn't want to listen. And he has to punish her if she doesn't listen. And you know, as a young child, I believed him. And I got so angry with my mother. Why doesn't she listen to her husband? You know, like... And that's why it's so important that children know that when they in abusive homes, that is not right. That is not normal. That is not what normal looks like. So yeah, sorry, I get very passionate.
No, it's okay. And I relate to a lot of that. You know, we had incidences as well when I was a very young child, and I often say, my context for that was also that it was normal. Until my parents got divorced and I moved because we stayed in a little small cul-de-sac and all the neighbors knew. And it was only after we moved and I went to a different school that I realized normal life is not like this. So just on that, you spoke about, you know, growing up in that environment where there is physical violence, where there's abuse. You also spoke very candid about verbal and emotional abuse and being called, even though you were a student. I think some of the things you listed was, one, you were always told sort of when you did things wrong, but you were never complimented or acknowledged for doing anything right. So for example, as an A student, you're bringing a good report. The good report was expected. A bad report, you were punished. And then you also mentioned when you were speaking now, lots of confusion as a child, especially after you sort of discovered that there was this abuse going on between your mother and your father.
Yeah.
How, as a child, did you process that as you were growing up?
You know, at first, I think the studying, I put all my energy into studying. I think that's why I never considered myself clever, but I studied very hard. I remember even with history, like, I used to sit in my room and I used to write the history dates on my wall, and I read a lot. And I think that was my escape, you know. My brother, he again handled it differently. But I mean, everybody handles it differently. My brother got into kind of mischief. He skipped school from a very young age. He used to skip school. Even from primary years, he used to skip school, and I mean that infuriated my dad. So they always got into trouble. But I mean, I can understand. Like, I have so much empathy for my brother, because my brother was 2 years old, like when my sister died, and I mean, he remembers stuff that he only now bits and pieces tell me when I wait for the right moment. I ask him like questions, because he still shuts down, like. But I mean, he remembers, because he was like a little bit over 2 years old, and that's how he dealt with it again. Like, he skipped school, he got into lots of mischief, and he was always in trouble with my dad. For me, I turned my energy into reading, so I read a lot, and I read, actually from a young age, I read romance novels, because I think, you know, like that. It's almost like you live in your own little dream world.
Yeah,
you know?
I did the same.
So whatever happens around you, you can escape to your own little world. And even my teacher, like I remember my English teacher, he was so surprised, because he one day caught me in school reading a romance novel, and he says, "You read the romance already? You like what? How old?" So, but that was my escape, you know. But not everybody has an escape. Like with my brother, I mean, I don't think he knew how to handle it. I don't think he knew how to handle everything. I mean, men don't talk, and my brother still. Like his wife gets so, she says to me, "I wish your husband, your brother would be more talkative." But she says most of the time it feels like she's having a one-sided conversation. She's actually talking to herself, because he would just nod and never take part in the conversation. But now and then I get something out of him, you know, like I would ask him and then he would tell me. And even now, like the other day, he surprised me even with more information, but he said, "Please don't tell anybody," because I asked him if I could tell you about it, and he said, "No, please."
Yes. And then I wanted to ask also about the, sorry to cut you, but you know, you're an A student, and your marks sort of your results took a dive in high school. And that was also, I mean, you mentioned earlier, you never thought that you were a smart child, and you were being repeatedly told that you were a stupid child, regardless of what you were bringing home.
Yeah, I remember the one time I got like a 98% in history. To get a 98% is like, and my dad said to me, he looked at my report and he said to me, "You know, if you could get a 98, you can get 100%, and he gave the report back. And I felt like I could sink, the earth could just swallow me up. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah, you come and you're so excited about the 98%, and then you're told that it's still not good enough.
And do you think that made you stop trying? That was
that's
sort of pointless,
but that's what I did. I stopped trying, because what was the point? And I mean, and when you're high school, I mean, now you like in primary school, it's you kind of a big fish in a small pool when you're an A student, right? But even if you're like an A student in say in high school, you like this small fish in a big pond. You know, nobody really notice you. And I mean, it's like for a child, it's important to have acknowledgement. Like in primary school, like you still have your teachers that acknowledge you. Do you know what I mean? Because you like a small fish in. But in high school, teachers don't really do. They have too many classes and they have too many students. Like, you know, so they don't really acknowledge. They would just say, "Well done," and there's your mark.
And so you could almost say that in primary school there was still, even though there was negative reinforcement at home, there was still some positive reinforcement at school. But at high school, you're basically just on your own.
Yeah, basically you're on your own.
And I think that might be, I think how you describe it in the book, and how you said earlier, just not trying, very hopeless.
Yeah.
And also there was even an attempt to take your life.
Yeah, and not just that. I mean, like you as human beings, like acknowledgement is what drives us. Because what would be the point? You know, especially as a child, like you need to be acknowledged in some way. Because as an adult, you can acknowledge yourself. You can, pat yourself on the back and say, well done, Lynn, or whatever. And you don't need that if you like sure of who you are, and you know that you're loved, and you know that you're not reliant on parents' love, or because you especially when you're a Christian, you know that God loves you, and you're here for a purpose, and you can serve others the way He served, and you're kind of not so reliant on acknowledgement but as a child growing up, I mean, especially in high school when you're a teenager and you go through that confused stage, because for me it was just like, what's the point? And I started skipping school, and like I remember in grade 10 now, but it was standard 8 back then, I still received the reward for best in mathematics standard grade. And when I went and in grade 9, I failed mathematics. I mean, you go from...
Which today would be a complete red flag.
Yes,
that
exactly.
there's something wrong. Lynn, we don't have a lot of time left, but I wanted to ask, you've written this book and you've done a lot of work. You've sought counseling, you've sought healing. As someone, and your book actually is Healing After Abuse.
Yeah.
So as someone who has been there, do you have a message for others who have grown up in this situation, who perhaps, as you said, are not even aware of the trauma that they might still hold?
Love yourself. I know it's difficult, but I went through this even before the book. I went through this. I was always lucky in the sense that I had very good managers. So one of my managers, and when I worked at UWC at one stage, he sent us for a weekend. It's where it's actually counselors that works with us, and they take us deep into our past and into. I remember I cried so much that weekend, but you come out of that weekend so refreshed and so ready to take on the world. And what I remember the one thing which I still do, like I still look in the mirror and I'm like, you valuable, you gorgeous, you good looking. I mean, you've got talents. I speak to myself in the mirror, and you need to find a way to build yourself up. I mean, just keep that in mind, that life is all about moving forward. And even if it's the slow pace, even if you don't feel like today is a good day, like make it a good day. Say to yourself, talk to yourself. Talk positive things to yourself. Don't talk negatively, because you're going to get into that rut of negative thinking if you talk negative to yourself. Talk positively about yourself and speak to people. I mean, don't hold things in, because we will never learn, and people don't know how you feel unless you tell them, So, and they won't, and you decide how people are going to treat you. You need to speak up, stand up.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for coming on the show and for sharing your story and for writing this book and sharing it with the world.
Thank you, Lenina, once again for having me. And, I just hope that my book inspires people to want to heal, because there is healing.
Yes. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching The Womxn Show, and tonight we're speaking about the intersection between violence against women and violence against children, and specifically the effect of domestic violence on children as they grow and as they become adults. Now, before the break, we heard from Lynn Nel, who is the author of The Right Daughter Speaks and who documented her journey growing up with domestic violence in the home. Now we're going to speak to clinical social worker Claudia Roodt, who specializes in trauma, and speak to her specifically about how trauma manifests in the body, manifests in the mind, in behaviors, and what we can do to both recognize it and deal with it. Claudia, and thank you so much for joining us. So,
My honor. It's my privilege.
So thank you, Claudia. So as you know, we're looking at today the intersections between violence against women and violence against children. And before the break, we had someone in studio who had actually written a book about the abuse that she had witnessed between her parents as she was growing up, some abuse also that she had experienced herself and her brothers at the hands of her father. And actually, the description she uses in the book is that she grew up with an angry father and a bitter mother. And we are just looking sort of at those intersections, and also she spoke a lot about the trauma that had resulted from all of that and carried over into as she grew up into an adult. So just to start with, let's look at something that's really spoken about. It's the children who witness domestic violence and the effect on them. One thing that the person before the break mentioned was that there was a lot of confusion as a child in terms of what's normal and what's not normal. And a lot of dissonance about what's good and what's valued inside the house versus outside in the world. And so I wanted to start with just asking, in your experience, is that confusion and that dissonance sort of a normal thing as a result of domestic violence? And what other sort of trauma does this situation hold for children?
Yeah, so I think I want to start by saying that, some of the experts talks about small trauma and big trauma. And I want us to be very careful about that, because there isn't actually such a thing. Your trauma is big for you and it might look small for someone else. So that's why when children witness violence between parents or dispute between parents where there's no repair between the parents, in other words, they stay a disconnect. And especially if the children is under the age of 7, because your rational brain only really starts forming by the age of 7. So your home and your caregivers and your parents, particularly if they're together, is your first view of the world. Now, if at other places that you go to, which is school and maybe aftercare, maybe you stay with a granny or an aunt or someone after school or at aftercare, if there's no other adult that shows you a different way where you feel safe, you're going to regard what happens at home as normal. And inevitably, the thing that people need to realize is your brain is an experience-based organ. So the brain goes familiar, not what is safe. But if I don't have a reference of something else that's safe, I tend to veer to what's familiar. So that's why subconsciously then, unless you find someone outside of your circle that can come alongside and be someone that do it differently, like another adult or a counselor or family member, you are bound to repeat the same cycle. That's number one. And number two is, what is being left in your nervous system is actually what the trauma is. The trauma doesn't happen when you witness it. The trauma is, so my nervous system must gear itself to protect itself from what I see here and how it scares me. So first of all, the child needs to put up a mask or find some way to survive this. Often those children that's exposed to that kind of violence, their survival technique is, let me not be seen. Let me disappear into my room and do my work or go onto the internet and meet people there. Let me just stay out of their way, because then I can't be in trouble. So children do it differently. The one is where they just disappear and become quiet to not be seen. The second one is the child that actually wants to get in between the parents and feel maybe that they need to protect the mother. and become almost like a parent figure and not be a child. And what I want to say to parents in particular is it's not about giving your child a conflict-free home, because that's abnormal. We all have differences. It's not about parents that's always in agreement, but it's about how do we have our differences of opinion and, yeah, get mad, sad, glad, angry, but it's about the repair that needs to happen. You know, Bruce Perry talks about, or actually Bruce Perry and a guy called, I'm trying to think his name, he's done the still face experiment. He says it's about the connect, the disconnect, and the reconnect. So if the children can witness the reconnect between the parents, where there's repair, and repair is not submission from either side. Repair is we talk through what's happened and we come to an understanding. If children sees that, that is a normal household. A normal household is not where people don't talk, there's never disagreements. But it's where there's these cycles of violence and cycles of dispute and cycles of I want to take you out between the parents, and it stays like that, and it becomes later on a fight where the children is used as pawn, and all they're seeing is it's almost like a tennis game. Who's now going to serve, and who's now going to hit the ball, and who's now going to do that, and they never see the repair. And that is why it's so important that when there's also a divorce, that the parents find a way to have a repair and an amicable relationship for the child's sake. Because I've seen it. I grew up in a very, my parents didn't fight necessarily, but there was this cold atmosphere, and we never spoke about feelings. And I always knew that there was this discord between my parents. So I don't have any recollection of repair that happened between them. And what parents need to realize is you might tonight talk in the bedroom and have a ceasefire. The children need to witness the repair so that it becomes part of their neural pathways in the brain. Otherwise, that is how they see conflict is left and not resolved.
It's very interesting that you're saying that, Claudia. And again, just to come back to the author that we spoke to before the break, and one of the things that she spoke about was how her father would kick her mother out of the house, literally, at night, and actually let that mother sleep outside the whole night without blankets, whether it was raining, and the mother would do that. And the next morning, the mom would come back in, shower, get dressed, go to work, as if nothing had happened. And what I often say on the show is that, and that was my personal experience also, was that we didn't witness reconnection. It was just, you went to bed, there was this big, episode, you went to bed and then woke up the next morning as if nothing had happened. And that was just
in the defense of the wife or the mother, I want to say that, and I've experienced it in my own domestic violence, is that you go into a frozen mode, and you actually just want to continue, because for you to process what happens and get to a point of repair is so utterly painful at that point in time. And that is why it's so crucial that when these things start unraveling at home, your children must go into counseling ASAP. Do not leave it and think, oh, they're children, they're going to be resilient it's been proven in neuroscience, children that doesn't have a reference of safety, and especially feeling in their body safety, it's much more difficult to try and repair them when later on, or as adults, instead of providing them a safe space earlier. So whether that's a granny, whether that's an aunt, but also preferably counseling where they can start processing what's happening to themselves and in their bodies.
So Claudia, so thank you for that. That was very, very interesting. I also wanted to ask, so one of the things that, again, coming back to the story the young woman spoke about was a feeling of hopelessness. You spoke earlier about sort of children will hide away, try and be invisible in the face of sort of the conflict and the arguments. She spoke also very much about hopelessness, and what that stemmed from was just I think negative attitudes from her parents. So there was no positive reinforcement really. And again, one element she spoke about is that in their home there was never any acknowledgement of doing well or doing good. There was no positive reinforcement. There was a lot of negative reinforcement. And one of the examples she gave was that, in the beginning, she tried really, really hard to be a good girl, to do well at school, and I think to earn affection from her parents. But at one stage, she got, I think, 98% for a history paper, and her father said, well, if you got 98, you could have gotten 100. And that was it. And she then spiraled into what she calls hopelessness. By high school, she stopped trying. And here we go into the space where you spoke about adults sort of noticing. For her, no one noticed. No one questioned why her result was automatically bad, not the teachers. She just said, as a young adult, no one saw her and no one cared.
So what I want to say to parents out there is a fear-driven brain cannot learn. Because a fear-driven brain, the rational part of the brain shuts down. It cannot work with an overload of cortisol. Now, a child that grows up in toxic stress where there's domestic violence cannot perform at school. I will never forget, I was in grade 7 when the shit really hit the fan at our house. And I was the only child left. I'm the youngest of 3 sisters. And also there was an overload of emphasis that year on my academical performance. Even more so than ever before. And it was the year that the discord between my parents was at the height of its, I don't know what to say. Well, the explosion happened. And when I then that year did not get a first, second, or third prize in my class, my father went ballistic. And in fact, that's one of the events that stood out for me. I still see the scene, how he sits in the chair after the prize giving, and my mother standing behind him, and he tells me, as far as I'm concerned, from tonight on, you don't exist anymore. And I'm looking at this man. I feel how my soul split in two. And I look at this man and I think, but you're the cause of this. And how that led to also me, in a way, trying to please him all the years, losing interest in one way, developing an eating disorder. Until looking back, I can see that when you're so engrossed in your own stuff, the children are forgotten. And my mother lives with us now, and now we can have conversations. And I said to her, I actually felt like an abandoned child. So it's very often that parents, when they're so involved in this dispute, in the despair, often the woman feels the despair, the fight for maintenance money, the custody, the fighting, maybe there's physical violence. But you have to remember those little souls, whether they're high school, primary, preschool, that's in your house, that didn't ask to be there. What is happening to them in this process?
Thank you, Claudia. And so just to ask then, women, we know that there are such high rates of gender-based violence, domestic violence and so forth. And you speak also about issues around after separation, possibly more physical violence, possibly, child maintenance issues, and all of these little things that add up to conflict. So I think, and I ask this question because there's a large emphasis on intimate partners within domestic violence situations, but not about the children. If a mother is, let's say, leaving an abusive situation, or she finds herself experiencing abuse even after she's left the marriage. And I mean this to say, if there is real danger, real violence, not sort of, not to call it normal conflict, because there is lots of escalation of conflict as well, but if there is real conflict or even an escalation of, what are ways that, what are things that parents can do to help still create stability for their children?
The one thing that worked for me and my children, I've got 2 adult daughters, and I've not been married once, more than once, is that I created a place where they could actually tell me how they have been affected and how they experience me in this, in the separation, in the divorce. And I forced myself, well, forced maybe the wrong word. I opened myself for their feedback. Otherwise, where else can they voice how it's affecting them? And I know as a mother, and I know as someone who in my last marriage experienced domestic violence, your own fear paralyzed you, and you just want to either numb it or get it away or out of the way, and you forget that you have these other human beings in your house that also need to be heard. And even if you then decide, okay, this is where we're going to stay, but you need to listen to their voice. Otherwise, they grow up and the belief system is, my voice doesn't matter. No, it doesn't matter in which relationship I am or what I view or what I witness. My voice and view doesn't matter. And I had to come to terms with that because I raised my girls like that it's important that you have a voice. But because I raised them like that, I also had to open myself for feedback. And yeah, some of the stuff was hurtful to hear, but I had to hear that. Otherwise, you go into this cocoon for yourself and self-preservation. And you forget that if you do not provide that space for them, that's the legacy that they're going to carry over to the next generation. Your voice doesn't matter.
And so, Claudia, just before we finish off, for the lady who wrote the book said that after she had written it, she received many letters from many people. Her brothers were astounded. Just, I think they received it very well, and they were quite emotional about the fact that someone had just voiced this
this invisible thing that had been going on their whole lives, but nobody was supposed to talk about. Her parents didn't acknowledge the book being written at all, though maintained sort of normal contact. But a lot of other people spoke about having come from similar backgrounds. And one very interesting letter she said she received was from a man who said that he was very much like her abusive father when he was younger, and he now realizes the effect of his actions, and then took some actions to try and I think make amends and apologize to some people. But what I think what I want to ask you about is for people who have come from backgrounds like that. So for her, a lot of the readers, it was the first time that they were realizing and acknowledging that these things that they grew up with is traumatic, because a lot of us think it's normal when we're in it, and that they still hold trauma. What are I think next steps? We know people can go for counseling, but it's not that accessible for everyone. I think what are ways of helping themselves coping, or I don't know, just ways to deal with sort of these sorts of trauma in one's life, maybe with counseling or in addition to counseling?
That's a very important question. I think that there's a couple of things that I want to say. The first one is, how well do you know yourself? High level of, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, of partners that you make in life, tells a lot about your belief system that stems from childhood trauma. Because your belief system either comes from parents that showed you you're important, you're wonderful, you wow, we hear you, your voice matters, or it's one of you either were invisible or abandoned. And even children that grow up in homes where there's material, a lot of stuff, can feel abandoned and neglected because you're never seen as a person. Your soul is not being developed. You don't feel important. So what is your level of self-awareness? That's the first thing. The second thing is that we normally make sense of our story by writing and telling our own story. And as you tell your own story, you become aware of, okay, so that part of my story is why I've been doing this. And you need to be able to connect the links. And then one of the most important things is, which a lot of people don't realize, and it's in the latter years with the development of body work, somatic work, and especially the development of trauma releasing from the body and the polyvagal theory, that people realize my nervous system actually determines what is it that triggers me and where does it sit in my body. And how well do you actually understand your nervous system and your triggers? So if people can work with that, what is my level of self-awareness? What is my story and how that linked to where I'm currently finding myself and behavior? What is the belief system I have about myself? What is this voice in my head telling me about myself? And your triggers, because people need to realize I cannot trigger something in you that's not already there. If I trigger you, it's like I hold up a mirror for you for stuff that's still unhealed in you. And to take notice of that, to become aware of that, and then maybe say, okay, maybe I need to go and find someone that can help me with this and work through this.
Okay, thank you.
And to remember that the biggest gift we can give ourselves and our children is our own healing.
Thank you so much, Claudia. That was so informative. Really, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing with our viewers.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That was Claudia Roodt, a clinical social worker who specializes in trauma, We're going to take a short break, but we'll be back with more after this. And that's all we have for this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lenina Rasool. Good night.